They buried it, locked it away as if silence could strangle the truth. In the winter of 1887, Scotland Yard sealed a file so disturbing it remained classified for nearly a century. 7 murders, each more grotesque than the last, carried out in London's wealthiest quarter, Belgravia. The victims were not paupers in the alleys of Whitechapel, but the lords and servants of empire itself. And the mark of death was not only violence, but something far more sinister. Carved into the flesh of every victim's chest, a mask, half tragedy, half comedy, etched with surgical precision. But the true horror was not the blade, it was the laughter. Imagine it hours after rigor mortis had stiffened the corpse, after the police surgeon confirmed time of death. Witnesses swore they heard laughter echoing from inside the home. Genuine laughter, not madness, not hysteria, joy. The kind of laughter you hear when someone has witnessed something delightful. The dead, laughing long after breath had left them. This was not the Ripper's chaos in the East End, nor some forgotten street crime of desperation. This was ritual, pattern. The signs of a mind so precise, so calculated, that every murder became performance. And London's most powerful men, the very architects of empire, whispered behind locked doors, because they knew the truth. The killer wasn't just mocking the victims, he was mocking the entire system. The lead investigator, Inspector Edmund Harwick, a man forged in both scholarship and blood, tracked these horrors relentlessly, until the night he too vanished, leaving behind a single note scrawled in his own hand: "The laughter never stops. It follows you home." For 90 years, they told you this case didn't exist. But I'm telling you, it did. And once you hear the truth, once you descend into this forbidden history, there's no climbing back into ignorance. Because you'll realize the laughing man wasn't just hunting the rich of Belgravia. He was hunting the illusion of safety itself. And as you listen, remember this: sometimes history is not buried because it is irrelevant. Sometimes it is buried because the living fear what the dead still whisper. London, 1887. Heart of the empire, jewel of Queen Victoria's reign, a city drowning in its own illusions of grandeur. On the surface it glittered. Gas lamps turned cobblestones into rivers of gold, and the smoke of coal fires mingled with the salt wind of the Thames. Parades for the Golden Jubilee had celebrated 50 years of power, wealth and order. To the world, London seemed untouchable. But beneath the carriages and parades, beneath the silks and pearls, was a sickness that could not be hidden behind marble facades and polite conversation. It was in Belgravia, where power's new aristocracy lived, that the sickness first showed its face. These weren't ancient lords with crumbling castles in the countryside. No, these were men who had clawed their fortunes from coal, steel, opium, and cotton. Railroad barons, mine owners, industrial kings. They bought their townhouses for obscene sums, their wealth washed clean with parties, salons, and philanthropy. Behind their white stucco walls, they drank French champagne and congratulated themselves on building an empire. But the truth: their fortunes had been forged in blood, in the sweat of child laborers choking in mines, in the chains of colonies stripped bare. And in the autumn of that year, death came knocking at their doors. Not with gunpowder, not with fire, with laughter. It began in silence, like a breath before a scream. A door left ajar when no servant would dare. Curtains trembling though no hand touched them. And then, the discovery. A servant laid out like a ritual offering, her silver hair arranged as if by loving hands, her face locked in the ecstasy of laughter. Not the kind that fades when the lungs run dry, but a joy sculpted into death itself. Around her neck, bruises of struggle. On her chest, the mask. And in the air, the unmistakable scent of something chemical, unnatural, engineered. Those who saw it swore that the room was not a murder scene, but a stage. A performance created not for money, not for revenge, but for message. The laughing man wanted the city to know their walls, their servants, their wealth, their legacy. None of it could shield them from the theater of his design, because every empire believes itself eternal until someone reminds it of its mortality. And in London, 1887, that reminder did not come from poverty's alleys. It came from inside their very homes, carried on the sound of laughter that would not die. October 15th, 1887. Fog rolled through Belgrave Square like a living thing, thick and suffocating, turning familiar streets into corridors of shadow. The wealthy liked to believe their gas lamps kept danger at bay, but that night, the lamps were nothing but floating orbs swallowed in grey. And into this nightmare returned Lady Margaret Harrington, fresh from an evening of opera and forced gaiety, her emerald gown catching stray droplets of mist as her cab clattered to a halt before the grand Harrington residence. She noticed it instantly. The door, open. Just a fraction, but enough to spill a warm glow into the choking fog, a golden invitation from a house that should have been sealed tight. For 23 years, her housekeeper, Mrs. Elenina Whitfield, had been unyielding in her rituals. Locks checked at 10, gaslights snuffed. Keys turned twice. Never, not once, had Lady Margaret seen her home vulnerable. Until now, her slippered feet tapped against wet stone as she ascended the steps, her gloved hand trembling on the brass handle. The silence pressed in, so thick it made her own breath sound foreign. "Mrs. Whitfield," she called, her voice swallowed by the mist. No answer, only the faint flicker of gaslight, stretching shadows across the polished marble floor. She stepped inside, and what she found did not belong to her world of social order and polite routine. The drawing room was chaos. A porcelain vase smashed, curtains torn from their fastenings, books scattered like dead birds, and at the center, like an actor placed deliberately in the spotlight, lay Mrs. Whitfield. Her silver hair, usually bound in severe austerity, had been spread out around her head with the care of an artist arranging a crown. Her hands were folded across her chest, the way one might prepare the dead for a Christian burial. But her face shattered the illusion of reverence. It was twisted into pure joy. Lips parted in rapture, eyes crinkled with delight, as though she had died at the height of laughter. The laughter still seemed to echo in the room, though the air was heavy with something else. A cloying sweetness, chemical, invasive, a perfume of medicine and rot. And carved just beneath her collarbone, shallow but deliberate, a mask of comedy and tragedy intertwined. Lady Margaret screamed, a sound that tore through the fog like glass through silence. But outside, the world heard nothing more than a faint cry swallowed by London's endless night. The stage had been set, and the laughing man had chosen his opening act. Dawn had barely touched the horizon when Inspector Edmund Harwick emerged from the fog, his tall frame casting a silhouette as sharp as the cut of his overcoat. To the people of Belgravia, Harwick was no ordinary policeman. He was the son of a blacksmith who had forged himself into one of Scotland Yard's most respected detectives. His eyes were dark, steady, and unblinking, the gaze of a man who had walked among corpses, catalogued the depths of human cruelty, and still clung to the idea that order could be wrestled from chaos. But even for him, this crime scene was unlike anything his years of service had prepared him for. The drawing room greeted him like a stage after a performance, furniture overturned, the velvet curtains ripped down like props discarded after a violent act. And at center stage, the body of Mrs. Whitfield, posed with such deliberate artistry that it defied the raw violence written across her bruised neck and torn hands. Harwick crouched beside her, his gloved fingers hovering over the carved mask etched into her chest. Comedy, tragedy, the eternal symbols of the theater, reduced here to a killer's signature. "Blimey, sir," whispered Constable Thornbury, his young assistant, barely 22 and already pale with nausea. "It's like she died laughing." Harwick didn't answer. He was studying the details, because the devil was always in the details. The way her hair had been arranged with surgical neatness. The folding of her hands, too careful to be accident. The mask, shallow but precise, as though the blade had been guided not by rage but intention. Whoever had done this had lingered after death, shaping the corpse not as a killer shapes a victim, but as an artist shapes his creation. And then there was the smell. Harwick inhaled carefully, his brow furrowing. Not the sour stench of death, something else. Something layered, medicinal, chemical. It reminded him of ether, the anesthetic surgeons used to silence screams. But this was more complex, a concoction he could not yet name. A signature just as distinct as the carved mask, whispering of a killer who understood chemistry as well as cruelty. He rose slowly, his voice measured, but carrying the weight of revelation. "This is no random act," he murmured. "This is theater." The young constable flinched at the word, but Harwick was right. The laughing man had not just killed a servant. He had written the prologue of a play, and the audience was all of London. Lady Margaret Harrington sat rigid in her emerald gown, the fire crackling weakly beside her, as though even the flames feared to intrude. Her porcelain face was drained of its aristocratic poise. her lace handkerchief trembling between fingers that had once commanded salons filled with dukes and barons. Now, she was no hostess, she was a witness, a survivor of something she could not name. Her voice, when it came, was brittle, clipped in the way only the privileged can be when their world has been shattered. She was always precise, Inspector. At 10 o'clock sharp, the doors locked. At 10:30, every lamp extinguished. I returned near midnight. She should have been in bed hours before. Never once in all my years here had she faltered, until tonight. Harwick studied her with the cold patience of a man who knew fear often dressed itself in propriety. Behind her carefully measured words, he heard it. The tremor, the fracture. She was not merely frightened, she was unmoored. And then came the detail that curdled the blood of every man in that room, the neighbors. Across the square, Mrs. Gertrude Pembroke, a widow with sharp eyes and sharper memory, confessed in a whisper that she had heard laughter from the Harrington home. Not the brittle, shallow laughter of drunken aristocrats, but the rich, rolling laughter of a woman utterly lost in joy. It went on for nearly an hour, Inspector, she said, clutching her shawl tighter. I thought perhaps Lady Margaret was entertaining guests, but no, it was the same voice again and again, laughing with such delight that it almost made me smile myself. Yet, her voice cracked, and she looked away. There was something wrong in it, something that did not belong in the living world. Harwick's jaw tightened. Mrs. Whitfield had been dead for hours by then, her time of death confirmed by the surgeon between 11 and midnight. And yet, neighbors swore they heard her laughter echoing through the fog at 2 in the morning. This was no mere crime. This was performance extended beyond death itself. The laughing man was not content to kill. He demanded an audience. He wanted his art to bleed into the night, to haunt the minds of those who listened. And as the whispers spread across Belgravia, one truth emerged like fog curling through a keyhole. The laughter had not stopped with Mrs. Whitfield. It was only beginning. The newspapers never printed the truth. Not then, not ever. The murder of Mrs. Whitfield, staged with such obscene care, should have torn through the drawing rooms of Belgravia like wildfire. Yet the morning after, the scandal sheets were curiously silent. A servant's unfortunate accident, a whispered rumor of illness, nothing more. For in Victorian London, appearances mattered more than life itself. The elites of Belgravia understood something Harwick already suspected: exposure was more dangerous than death. A dead housekeeper could be explained, buried, forgotten. But laughter echoing from the corpse, a carved mask upon the chest, that was contagion. That was corruption of order itself, and the empire could not afford corruption, not where the world might see. But Harwick was not bound by their silence. He had walked too long among London's shadows to be fooled by polite lies. He saw the pattern emerging. He felt it like a spider's web tightening around him. This was no single tragedy. It was ritual, performance, and each act had meaning. For weeks he retraced every detail, the sweet chemical scent that lingered in the room, the deliberate folding of the hands, the theatrical mask etched into flesh. These were not flourishes of madness, they were symbols, messages. Harwick remembered another case years before, involving a disgraced physician at Bethlehem Royal Hospital, a man obsessed with experiments on the boundary between anesthesia and consciousness. That doctor had claimed laughter was not just emotion, but a weapon, that it could be induced, shaped, controlled, that under the right conditions, a man could be forced to laugh even as his body broke. The physician had ended his life before the courts could sentence him. But his research, destroyed, they said, or perhaps taken. The thought gnawed at Harwick as he pored over the evidence. The laughing man was not simply a murderer. He was a conductor. Every scene, every body, was an orchestrated composition of terror and joy. A grotesque symphony meant not only to mock the victim, but to draw power from those who witnessed it. And in the silence of his office, surrounded by files that others refused to touch, Harwick whispered a truth too dangerous to speak aloud. This killer wasn't hunting individuals. He was dismantling illusions. He was carving through the empire's mask of civility, exposing the rot beneath. And the laughter was the sound of truth, echoing through the cracks of a society desperate to pretend it was whole. It came swiftly, like the second act of a play, deliberate, timed, inevitable. Barely 3 weeks after Mrs. Whitfield's death, the fog of London carried with it another grotesque performance. This time, the victim was no servant tucked away in shadows. No, the laughing man had chosen his next audience carefully. Mr. Alastair Pembroke, a barrister of fine reputation and finer arrogance, was discovered in his study just past dawn. The door had been locked from the inside, the key still resting in his pocket. His wife, frantic and pale, swore she had heard him laughing in the early hours. Long, rolling bursts of joy that seemed so uncharacteristic, so alien, that she prayed it was simply the release of drink. But when she entered at sunrise, she found her husband seated at his desk as though presiding over trial, except his powdered wig had been split neatly down the center, and upon his chest was carved the second mask, tragedy. The face etched into his flesh was unmistakable, its lines contorted into grief, a cruel mirror to the smile his corpse still bore. His eyes were wide, fixed in a stare that seemed less like death and more like astonishment, as though he had witnessed something no living man was meant to see. But it was not the carving alone that chilled Harwick when he arrived. It was the staging. For Pembroke's walls, lined with books of law, precedent, justice, had been defaced. Each spine slashed, each page torn, scattered across the floor like snow, and scrawled across the desk, in the victim's own blood, were words that should never have belonged together. Adel mening ugchend. The household was in chaos. Servants wept. Mrs. Pembroke fainted thrice. Yet the neighbors told the same story as before, laughter echoing well after the man's death, rolling across the square at an hour when no voice should have carried. Some swore they heard not one laugh, but many, layered upon each other like a chorus, the kind of chorus that haunts theatergoers long after the curtain falls. Harwick studied every inch of the crime scene, his face carved from stone, though Thornbury saw his superior's hand tighten ever so slightly as he traced the carved mask with his glove. The inspector was no stranger to murder, but this was not just escalation. This was proclamation. The laughing man had raised the stakes. A servant was merely the prologue. Now, the victims were the empire's own barristers, lawmakers, the keepers of order. And with each act, the message grew clearer. London itself was the stage, and every man and woman in its gilded streets sat in the audience, waiting to see who would be called next. And somewhere in the fog, unseen, unheard, the laughing man was smiling. By the time the second body was lowered into the earth, London was no longer whispering. It was gasping. The fog that clung to the city streets seemed thicker now, as though the very air was complicit. Carriages rattled faster down Belgravia Square. The lamps were lit earlier, though they did little to cut the gloom. And in parlours from Mayfair to Whitechapel, conversations ended abruptly whenever laughter rang too brightly, too long, as though mirth itself had been poisoned. The Pembroke murder had torn the veil. A housekeeper's death could be ignored, brushed away with coin and euphemism. But a barrister, and officer of the court, slain in his own home and made into a grotesque spectacle, that could not be buried, not even by the gilded fists of London's elite. Still they tried. The city's papers were instructed to print half-truths, sudden seizures, melancholy accidents, a rising tide of mania among the fashionable set. But the people were not fooled. Londoners carried the truth in their bones. The laughter had been heard, the masks had been seen. At taverns, dockside brothels, and supper clubs alike, the tales grew. Some claimed the laughing man was an actor gone mad, driven to punish the audience that once scorned him. Others swore he was a spirit of plague returned to collect what the pestilence had not finished. A few, whispering low so as not to invite doom, believed he was not a man at all but an idea. Laughter made flesh, eternal and hungry. Inspector Harwick felt the hysteria tightening with each passing night. He knew what fear could do to a city already teetering between empire and decay. Merchants shuttered shops early, theatres played to half-empty houses. Even the opera, once the heart of London's decadence, sat hollow, its balconies cloaked in shadows. But it was in the gentlemen's clubs of Pall Mall that the fear was ripest. Behind cigar smoke and tumblers of brandy, the empire's titans spoke in low, quivering tones. The mask was no longer metaphor, it was threat. And if the killer's performance continued, it would not just unravel lives, it would unravel power. Harwick understood better than most. This was no random slaughter. The laughing man was deliberate, his victims chosen with surgical cruelty. With each act, he mocked not only flesh but order itself. Each laugh in the night was a stitch ripped from the Empire's own tapestry, and as Harwick stood at his office window, watching the fog curl like a living thing across Westminster Bridge, a terrible thought gnawed at him. The city was no longer merely the stage. It was becoming the audience too, and audiences, once entranced, never looked away until the final curtain. The third murder shattered any illusion of safety. It was not hidden away in some forgotten servant's room, nor cloaked behind the oak doors of a private study. No, this time, the laughing man chose spectacle. He chose the heart of London society, a ballroom gleaming with chandeliers and champagne, where the Empire's finest gathered to toast themselves. Lady Margaret Henslow, widow of a shipping magnate and patroness of the opera, was hosting one of her famous soirees. The grand house on Grosvenor Square, glittered with silk gowns and polished boots, the air thick with gossip and Strauss waltzes, and yet, at the very height of revelry, the music faltered. A single unnatural sound cut through the violins. Laughter, not the polite tinkling reserved for society banter, but raw, uncontrollable, rolling mirth that made the guests shift uncomfortably in their masks of civility. All eyes turned to the balcony, and there she stood, Lady Margaret herself, her jeweled necklace gleaming, her arms stretched as if in greeting. For a moment, some believed it was performance, a touch of theatre to delight her guests. But then her body convulsed. Her laughter grew sharper, more grotesque, echoing off the marble walls. A scream finally tore from the crowd as Lady Margaret's body pitched forward, plummeting from the balcony to the polished floor below. When Harwick arrived, the room was chaos. Guests huddled in corners, sobbing into lace handkerchiefs. Servants whispered prayers in the shadows. Lady Margaret's corpse lay precisely arranged, as though some unseen hand had guided her fall. And there, carved deep into her chest, was the third mask, its features a hideous hybrid of joy and sorrow, as though mocking both extremes at once. But it was not the carving alone that chilled Harwick, it was the mask she wore. For upon Lady Margaret's face, stitched crudely with wire into the corners of her mouth, was a permanent grin, a grotesque parody of the society smile she had once mastered so well. Above, on the balcony, scrawled in chalk across the wall where she had stood, were words that turned even the most hardened constables pale: The Hus SVL, Th Pillow Begenis. This was no longer murder in secret. This was theatre, unveiled before the highest echelons of power. The laughing man had announced himself to London not as a killer lurking in shadows, but as a performer demanding the city's attention. And the worst truth struck Harwick like a blade between the ribs. London was watching. London was listening. And London was enthralled. Inspector Harwick had seen horrors. Bodies left in the filth of Whitechapel, men gutted in dockside taverns. But nothing unsettled him like Lady Margaret's ballroom death. It was not just murder, it was choreography. The laughing man had written himself into society's script, and the city was spellbound. By the following dawn, London was divided into two camps, those who feared to leave their homes, and those who longed to see what would happen next. The newspapers, despite government orders to suppress, could not resist. Their front pages screamed with ink, "The masked killer strikes again! A new terror in Grosvenor Square! London held hostage by Laughter!" What was meant to be silence became a chorus instead. The killer had found his amplifier. Harwick sat at his desk, the crime report scattered before him like a deck of cursed cards. Mrs. Whitfield, a servant; Pembroke, a barrister; Lady Margaret, a patroness of the arts. Different classes, different circles. But why these three? He traced their names with his finger, his mind clawing for connection. Then his eyes narrowed. Each victim had ties to the theatre. Whitfield's former employer had financed productions in Drury Lane. Pembroke had been a trustee for the Theatre Royal. Lady Margaret had not only funded the opera, she had dismissed an entire troupe 5 years prior after a scandal involving unpaid wages. The pattern was faint but undeniable. This was no random madness. The laughing man's play was written in the blood of those who touched the stage. "Sir," Thornbury's nervous voice cut through the silence, "if it's the theatre he's after, then London's stages are his hunting ground." Harwick finished grimly, pushing back from the desk. His chair scraped like a scream across stone. Every curtain that rises, every seat that's filled, it's his invitation. And God help us, Thornbury, the audience is already waiting for him. Even as he spoke, the inspector could hear the city shifting. Outside, laughter rang sharper than before. Children's games cut short when mothers pulled them inside, shopkeepers glaring at drunks who chuckled too loudly in the street. Laughter itself had become suspicious, like a mask one might wear too convincingly. Yet beneath the terror, Hawick sensed something worse: excitement. London's people, starved for distraction, were being seduced by the spectacle. The city's fear was not driving it away. It was drawing it closer, binding it tighter to the stage the laughing man had built. And as Hawick gathered his coat and revolver, one truth pressed down upon him: the killer was not hiding anymore. He was directing. The murders were not the play. They were only the opening act. The gas lamps outside the Theatre Royal flickered like nervous eyes as Inspector Hawick positioned himself among the shadows. The night was thick with drizzle, the cobblestones glistening under carriage wheels. To any passerby, it was another evening in London's restless heart. But Hawick knew better. The laughing man thrived on spectacle, and tonight the stage was set. Inside, the house was packed. Every velvet seat had been sold twice over, the crowd buzzing with an odd mixture of dread and fascination. Would the killer strike here? Would they be witnesses or victims? Londoners had always loved drama, but now they were paying not for actors, but for danger itself. Hawick and Thornbury moved like ghosts through the aisles, eyes scanning faces. He had placed constables at every exit, stationed plainclothesmen in the rafters and backstage. No mask, no grin, no flicker of laughter would escape his net tonight. The curtain rose. Gaslight bathed the stage in golden warmth as the actors began their lines. Their words, though rehearsed, trembled with fear. The audience leaned forward, breaths shallow, every creak of the boards magnified in the tension. Then it came, at first soft, a chuckle low and throaty rolling from the upper balcony. Heads turned. Some guests smirked nervously, mistaking it for a drunkard's outburst. But Hawick's chest tightened. He knew that sound. The laughter swelled, richer, crueler, impossibly loud. The actors froze mid-line, their mouths open like broken marionettes. The audience stirred, a ripple of panic spreading through silk gowns and polished boots. "Up there!" Hawick barked, shoving through the aisle as Thornbury followed. Constables charged toward the balcony. The laughter cut, sudden as a knife. Silence thundered through the theater. And then, from the rafters, a shape dropped. Not a man, but a grotesque effigy, stuffed with straw, dressed in a tattered suit, its face covered by a painted grin. It swung above the stage on a noose, turning slowly, mockingly, as if bowing to the crowd. Gasps gave way to screams. Pinned to the dummy's chest was a placard scrawled in jagged chalk, ACTWOBE to ACT Jesus. A cheers erupted. Patrons stampeded for the exits, shrieking as the dummy swayed overhead. Hawick pushed past the tide, his eyes scanning for movement, for a glimpse of the real killer. But there was nothing. No door forced, no shadow fleeing, only terror, perfectly orchestrated. And as the theater emptied into the fog-drenched streets, Hawick felt it settle in his bones. He had not cornered the laughing man. He had been cast in his play, and worse. London was applauding. Morning found Hawick at Scotland Yard, his office thick with the stench of tobacco and failure. Reports cluttered his desk, but he could barely look at them. Every page screamed the same truth: he had been played. The laughing man hadn't just outwitted the police. He had written them into his script, and the inspector himself had taken center stage. London awoke to headlines dripping with scorn. THL London Lux THLO Police TR and NTO Police HN. The public devoured every word, not with pity for the dead, but with a ghoulish thrill. The killer had become entertainment. And in that entertainment, the yard had become a laughingstock. Thornbury paced like a caged hound, wringing his hands. "Sir, if we don't catch him soon, they'll strip the case from us. They'll say we're part of his performance, fuel to his fire." Hawick's jaw clenched. He knew Thornbury was right. Already, whispers of resignation had crept into the corridors. Men muttered that perhaps the inspector was cursed, that wherever he stepped, the killer followed. Not to be caught, but to be seen. Yet Hawick felt something deeper stirring. This wasn't simply murder. The laughing man wasn't interested in bodies alone, he wanted audience. Each death had been staged not just for effect, but for maximum attention. Lady Margaret in her ballroom, the dummy over the Theatre Royal, the words scrawled in chalk, like a playwright's notes to the actors. It struck him then, sharp and undeniable. The killer wasn't mocking the police. He was using them. Every chase, every failed trap, every headline, it all fed the performance. The city watched because the police were players in the spectacle. Without them, the stage would be silent. Harwick stood, his coat heavy on his shoulders. Thornbury, we've been thinking like constables. We need to start thinking like critics. He's not a phantom. We're in his theater. And if we're in his theater, his voice dropped grim and steady. Then there must be a script. The young sergeant blinked. A script, sir. Harwick nodded. Connections, themes, an arc. He's building to something. And if we can find the ending before he delivers it, we might still have a chance to close the curtain on him. But even as he said the words, Harwick's stomach churned. Play's end in climax. And with the City of London as his audience, the laughing man would not settle for anything less than an unforgettable finale. The rain had not stopped for 3 days, drumming against London like the sound of distant applause. Harwick walked the slick streets of Covent Garden, the smell of wet brick and horse dung rising in the fog. Theatres lined the square like jeweled coffins. Grand, gilded facades masking debts, scandals, and desperate actors clawing for relevance. If the laughing man's killings were threaded to the stage, then somewhere in this district lay the missing line of his script. Harwick pushed open the doors of the theatre archive, a cramped vault of ledgers, playbills, and records thick with dust. Inside, an elderly clerk shuffled papers with trembling fingers, his spectacles perched precariously. Harwick presented his badge. I need every record of dismissed actors, unpaid companies, bankrupt managers, anyone cast out or ruined these past 10 years. The clerk, pale and curious, led him to the back. Hours passed. Paper cut into Harwick's fingers, ink bled into his cuffs, until finally, there it was. A troupe, once rising, now forgotten, the Merry Fools Company. 5 years ago, they had staged a daring production that mocked the wealthy patrons themselves. Lady Margaret, one of the targets of their satire, had them blacklisted. Debts mounted, wages went unpaid. The company fractured. Some drifted to menial work, others vanished into the abyss of poverty. But one name leapt from the yellowed page like a dagger: Elias Greaves. An actor, praised for his unnerving comic roles, always cast as the jester, the trickster, the fool who laughs as others weep. Reviews called him brilliant but unsettling. His final performance ended in chaos when he refused to break character, laughing manically long after the curtain fell until the stagehands dragged him off. No record of him existed after that night. Harwick felt the blood drain from his face. Greaves fit the pattern too perfectly. The dismissed servant, the ruined barrister, Lady Margaret, they all had ties to the collapse of the Merry Fools. The killer was not just spilling blood, he was delivering a revenge performance, an encore demanded of the city that mocked and discarded him. Outside, the newsboys cried through the mist, "Another message from the laughing man!" Another warning. Harwick seized a paper, unfolding it with stiff hands. Pasted across the front was a crudely drawn playbill, delivered anonymously to the press. In jagged ink it read, "London, prepare for the grand masquerade. The final act approaches." Beneath the words, a stage was sketched, the audience drawn as faceless masks. And at its center, a lone figure bowed deeply, laughter spilling from his inked grin. Thornbury, reading over his shoulder, whispered, "Sir, if he's calling it a masquerade, he means to gather them all. A full house." Harwick closed the paper, the damp edges crumpling in his fist. The script was no longer hidden. The laughing man was promising his finale, and every soul in London was invited. London waited on edge, caught between horror and fascination. The papers brimmed with speculation. Society whispered in anxious salons, and every theatre whispered the name. No one dared say aloud the laughing man. The city had become a stage, its citizens actors in a drama they could neither control nor escape. Harwick moved like a predator through the fog, choked streets, tracing patterns in the victims' connections, the dismissed actors, the ruined troops, and the grotesque props left behind. Each clue, each mask, each carved symbol was part of a design, an architecture of madness. And now the finale loomed. The Merry Fools had once performed in the grandest halls, but Greaves had learned to work in shadows. Rumors led Harwick to a derelict theatre near the Thames, a place abandoned after a fire had claimed its wings. Gas lamps flickered along the walkways, casting skeletal shadows that seemed to twist and bow in silent laughter. Here the lines between performance and reality blurred. Inside, the scent of damp wood and chemical mixtures lingered. Every corner held the residue of meticulous preparation, chalked marks on the floor, rigged pulleys, and scaffolds built for observation. Harwick traced the footprints, feeling the chill that came not from the cold, but from the certainty of watching something alive, waiting to strike. This was more than murder, it was control. The laughing man had manipulated London itself, turning curiosity into fear, fear into obsession, and obsession into spectacle. Every wealthy patron, every servant, every city watchman had unwittingly become a participant. Harwick paused near the center of the theater, where a single mask rested atop a pedestal. Its grin was impossibly wide, frozen in that same grotesque, theatrical laughter. He touched it lightly, and the sound of distant echoes filled the hall. Voices, laughter, whispers, all layered, all sinister. He realized then Greaves had designed the city as a labyrinth of dread. The finale would not simply be a murder. It would be a revelation. And in this hall of shadows, Harwick felt the pull of something ancient, something that spoke not to the flesh, but to the mind, the power to bend reality, to warp perception, to make the audience complicit. London itself had become his stage. And for those who watched too closely, the line between performance and life would vanish forever. Before moving further, Harwick turned to Thornbury, his voice low, commanding, yet heavy with urgency. "Write it down, Thornbury. 2 words. Laughing mask. Laughing mask. The city will see, and those who comment, who repeat it, will awaken to what we face. Those who ignore it will be lost to the act." The ritual was not superstition. It was engagement, a binding of awareness and attention, a signal that reality itself was being rewritten through fear and fascination. Harwick's eyes scanned the rafters. Somewhere above, in shadow, Greaves waited, not just for death, but for the surrender of the city's mind. The night of the grand masquerade descended like a living thing over London. Fog slithered through streets, curling around gas lamps, pressing against walls, entering homes like a whispered secret. Citizens lined the avenues, drawn by morbid curiosity, by fear, by the intoxicating pull of the forbidden. Harwick knew that somewhere in the shadows, Elias Greaves watched them all, every movement choreographed to perfection. Inside the derelict theater, the air was thick with the scent of incense and chemicals, masking the faint iron tang of blood. The stage had been rebuilt, elevated, and framed with grotesque masks carved from wood and plaster. Every row of seating, every balcony, every corner held his traps, some for observation, some for terror, and some for death. The first guests arrived, drawn like moths to flame, unsure if they were attending a performance or witnessing their own demise. Greaves appeared then, not with haste but with patience, stepping into the flickering candlelight. He wore the guise of a master, a conductor of chaos. His smile was a painted crescent of madness, his eyes glittering with intellect and menace. Harwick and Thornbury slipped through the shadows, tracking the killer while avoiding the hysteria swelling among the crowd. It was clear now this was not just vengeance. It was ritual, a ceremony designed to strip the powerful of their illusions, to expose the rot beneath their silk and marble, to show London that control is always an illusion. The first act began. A wealthy patron collapsed, his laughter cut short by a precise blow. Murmurs rose into screams. Yet the audience could not leave. The theater had become a trap, the exits locked, the streets outside filled with fog and confusion. Panic and fascination intertwined, fear becoming a spectacle, the city itself a participant. Harwick realized then the magnitude of what they faced. Greaves had transcended mere murder. He was bending reality, using expectation, superstition, and human curiosity as instruments of power. Every scream, every gasp, every horrified glance was a note in his symphony. And then, in the center of the stage, Greaves turned fully toward the inspector. Time slowed.